The most revealing moments in Washington are rarely the ones staged for cameras. They're the ones engineered to avoid them. And that's exactly what this latest Bondi-Trump MAGA maneuver looks like. A rush job briefing with barely any notice, no oath, no transcript, no public record designed not to illuminate the truth, but to fog it up just long enough to slip past accountability. Let's start with what should be a bright red line in any functioning democracy. When the Attorney General of the United States is under subpoena and due to appear for an under oath deposition, the obligation is simple. Show up, answer questions, and let the record speak. Full stop. The MAGA version of law and order, however, always comes with an asterisk. It means law and order for everyone else. For them, it's smoke, mirrors, and procedural sabotage. According to the account here, Attorney General Pam Bondi attempted to convene a closed-door session with roughly 24 hours' notice, an alleged briefing on the Epstein files, while simultaneously facing a subpoena from the House Oversight Committee for a deposition set for April 14. That timing is not subtle. It's not a coincidence. It's the political equivalent of setting off a flare to distract from the fact that you're walking away from the deposition table. And Democrats walked in wary because they've seen this movie before. Manufacture a "we already answered everything" talking point in a room with no cameras, then use it as cover for refusing testimony that actually carries legal consequences for lying. That's the central trick. Under oath, you can't just freestyle your way through misinformation. Under oath, your evasions have weight. Under oath, your contradictions become evidence. Under oath, the public doesn't have to guess what you said because there's a transcript and a record and a mechanism for accountability if you perjure yourself. So if the goal were transparency, real transparency, Bondi would welcome the deposition, not try to replace it with an off-the-record performance where she can answer without answering and claim compliance without being bound by it. Democrats, in this telling, identified the setup immediately and refused to play along, storming out once it became clear Bondi would not commit to appearing under oath as required by subpoena. That walkout wasn't theatrics. It was a refusal to legitimize a process built specifically to erase accountability. It's easy for Republicans to sneer and say Democrats don't want answers. But answers without a record are not answers, they're public relations. A briefing without an oath is not truth-seeking. It's narrative management. And narrative management is what MAGA does when the facts are dangerous. What makes this moment even more combustible is the allegation that, around the same time, Rep. Dan Goldman surfaced an unredacted document, or notes that had previously been redacted by Trump's DOJ, an act framed here as hiding key details about Trump's ties to Epstein and, by implication, obstructing scrutiny of those ties. The story being told is not merely that documents exist, but that there was a conscious effort to keep certain parts of those documents from public view until Democrats pushed hard enough to pry them open. And that's where the pattern becomes unmistakable. In the MAGA era, the cover-up is never just an after-the-fact scramble. It's part of the governance model. When Republicans control the levers of power, oversight becomes selective. When Democrats demand transparency, the machinery suddenly breaks. Schedules suddenly become inconvenient. And the public is told to accept informal reassurances in place of formal testimony. We released what we're going to release, as described here, isn't compliance. It's unilateral decree. It's the posture of someone who thinks the law is optional when it applies to them. There's also a critical political detail embedded in the reported exchange. The GOP chair, James Comer, allegedly responding to Democratic questioning with the kind of insult that would be unacceptable in a legitimate hearing environment, and doing so precisely because the environment was engineered to be less accountable. When you remove cameras and transcripts, you don't just protect the witness, you embolden the enablers. That's the point. A closed, untranscribed room becomes a safe space for contempt, contempt for oversight, contempt for women demanding accountability, contempt for the idea that public power should be exercised in public view. Now, if Republicans were acting in good faith, they would understand why the difference between briefing and deposition matters. They would remember their own behavior during the Biden administration. when they treated every procedural wrinkle as a constitutional crisis and demanded public recorded testimony from officials they wanted to harass, they would acknowledge that they cannot spend years screaming about subpoenas and contempt and then shrug when the Attorney General refuses to commit to appearing under oath. But this isn't about consistency. MAGA politics isn't a philosophy. It's a loyalty test. The rule is simple. Protect Trump at all costs, even if it means degrading the basic oversight function of Congress. The ethical stakes are even higher because of what the underlying subject matter represents. The Epstein case is not an abstract partisan football. It is tied to credible allegations of sex trafficking and exploitation, to the lives of real survivors, to a sprawling history of institutional failure and elite impunity. When the Attorney General plays games with transparency around this case or around documents that might clarify who knew what, who did what, and who protected whom, the damage is not just political. It is moral. It tells survivors that the powerful still get to rewrite the rules, still get to hide behind process, still get to decide what the public deserves to know. And let's talk about the deeper strategic reason Democrats are right to be suspicious. In an era of disinformation, a briefing can be a weapon. You can walk out of it and spin it any way you want. You can claim you were cooperative while refusing the one setting where your statements can be tested. You can cede talking points we already answered that friendly media will repeat until it becomes conventional wisdom. And you can do all of it without leaving a record for reporters, watchdogs, or the public to examine. That is not oversight. It is an information operation. There's also the national security undertone raised in the account. The idea that compromising material, real or perceived, can be used for blackmail, foreign manipulation, or coercion. Whether or not every claim in that arena ultimately holds up, the core principle is unimpeachable. When a public official's vulnerabilities are hidden behind secrecy and evasion, the public is forced to rely on faith rather than facts. And faith is precisely what Trumpism demands. Faith in the leader, faith in the narrative, faith that the deep state is always to blame, faith that you should never ask for receipts when the receipts might implicate the wrong people. That's why the demand for an under oath deposition is not some procedural fetish. It is the bare minimum for credibility. If Bondi is certain she has complied with the law, she should say, on the record, under oath, yes, I will appear, yes, I will answer. If the documents are complete, she should be willing to defend that completeness in a setting where evasions are visible and contradictions are traceable. If she cannot or will not, then the obvious question is, what is she protecting and who is she protecting? This is the broader reality Democrats are confronting, a Republican Party that no longer sees government as a public trust, but as a fortress for its chosen leader. A party that treats oversight not as a constitutional responsibility, but as a tactical nuisance. A party that weaponizes institutions when it can and sabotages them when it can't. The briefing described here isn't a quirk, it's a symptom. It's the MAGA method. Degrade the process, discredit the investigators, muddy the record, and then accuse everyone else of partisanship for insisting the law apply equally. And it's worth saying plainly, if your defense is, we answered questions, but you refuse to do it under oath, you're not defending transparency, you're advertising fear. Fear of perjury, fear of cross-checking, fear of the record, fear that the facts won't hold. Because here's the thing Trump and his allies never want to acknowledge. The American people are not obligated to accept unverifiable claims from powerful officials operating in secrecy. Democracy doesn't run on trust, it runs on documentation, oversight, and consequences. If Bondi wants to be treated like a credible steward of justice, she has to behave like one. If Republicans want to pretend they care about justice for survivors, they have to stop using survivors as rhetorical shields while they block the mechanisms that might actually produce accountability. What happened next, based on this account, is exactly what should happen when the majority tries to launder evasion through a fake process. Democrats refused to normalize it. They walked out. They stated the obvious. No oath, no transcript, no cameras, no deal. And that decision, infuriating to MAGA spin doctors, is the clearest statement that someone in Washington still understands the assignment. Because if you let them get away with replacing sworn testimony with closed-door messaging sessions, you're not just losing a news cycle, You're surrendering the idea that public power must answer to the public. And that is the one surrender we cannot afford.